The eldest judge leaned forward across the table, and his voice became suavely derisive. You speak as if you're fighting for some sort of principle, Mr. Reardon. But what you're actually fighting for is only your property, isn't it? Yes, of course. I am fighting for my own property. Do you know what kind of principle that represents? You pose as a champion of freedom, but it's only the freedom to make money that you're after. Yes, of course. I want this freedom to make money. Do you know what that freedom implies? Surely, Mr. Reardon, you wouldn't want your attitude to be misunderstood. You wouldn't want to give support to the widespread impression that you are a man devoid of social conscience, who feels no concern for the welfare of his fellows, and work for nothing but his own profit. I work for nothing but my own profit. I earn it. There was a gasp, not of indignation, but of astonishment, in the crowd behind him, and the silence from the judge he faced. He went on calmly. No, I do not want my attitude to be misunderstood. I shall be glad to state it for the record. I am in full agreement with the facts of everything said about me in the papers. With the facts, but not with the evaluation. I work for nothing but my own profit, which I make by selling my product they need to men who are willing and able to buy it. I do not produce it for their benefit at the expense of mine, and they do not buy it for my benefit at the expense of theirs. I do not sacrifice my interest to them, nor do I sacrifice theirs to me. We deal as equals, by mutual consent to mutual advantage. And I am proud of every penny that I have earned in this manner. I am rich, and I am proud of every penny I own. I made my money by my own effort, in free exchange and through the voluntary consent of every man I dealt with. The voluntary consent of those who employed me when I started. The voluntary consent of those who work for me now. And the voluntary consent of those who buy my product. I shall answer all the questions you are afraid to ask me openly. Do I wish to pay my workers more than their services are worth to me? I do not. Do I wish to sell my product for less than my customers are willing to pay for me? I do not. Do I wish to sell at a loss to give it away? I do not. If this is evil, do whatever you please about me, according to whatever standards you hold. These are mine. I am earning my own living, as every honest man must. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact of my own existence, and the fact that I must work in order to support it. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact that I am able to do it, and do it well. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact that I am able to do it better than most people. The fact that my work is greater value than the work of my neighbors, and more men willing to pay me. I refuse to apologize for my ability. I refuse to apologize for my success. I refuse to apologize for my money. If this is evil, make the most of it. If this is what the public finds harmful to its interests, let the public destroy me. I have done more good for my fellow men than you can ever hope to accomplish, but I will not say it, because I do not seek the good of others as a sanction for my right to exist, nor do I recognize the good of others as a justification for the seizure of my property and their destruction of my life. I will not say that the good of others was the purpose for my work. My own good is my purpose, and I despise the man who surrenders his. I could say to you that you do not serve the public good, that nobody's good can be achieved at the price of human sacrifice, that when you violate the right of one man, you have violated the rights of all, and a public of rightless creatures is doomed to destruction. I could say to you that you will and can achieve nothing but universal devastation, as any looter must. When he runs out of victims, I could say it, but I won't. It is not your particular policy that I challenge, but your moral premise. If it were true that men could achieve their good by means of turning some men into sacrificial animals, then I were asked to immolate myself for the sake of the creatures who wanted to survive at the price of my blood. If I were asked to serve the interests of society apart from, above and against my own, I would refuse. I would reject it as the most contemptible evil. I would fight it With every power I possess, I would fight the whole of mankind. If 1 minute were all I could last before I were murdered, I would fight in the full confidence of the justice of my battle and of living beings' rights to exist. Let there be no misunderstanding about me. If it is now the belief that my fellow men who call themselves the public, that their mood requires victims, then I say, the public would be damned. I will have no part of it. What I just read was an excerpt from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which has, quite frankly, become sort of my Bible recently. But I'm not here to really necessarily, talk about the book. I just read what is, without a hands down, is indeed my favorite part of the book, which is in book 2. And it's the trial of Hank Rearden, which I don't care what people say. I think Hank Rearden, in my opinion, is my favorite fictitious character of all time. I absolutely adore Hank Rearden, everything he stands for, and even his flaws, which you can tell is a good character, which even though they have flaws, you still support them and everything like that. And I have not really talked about Ayn Rand that much on my YouTube channel or Atlas Shrugged, for the specific reason that she is definitely a very controversial subject. People certainly hate her and despise her, while some people certainly love her and adore her. I fall into that category. I absolutely adore her and love her. She was a very flawed individual, don't get me wrong. She did some very morally, at least in my opinion, some morally questionable things, specifically with her husband. I still love her teachings. Not so much her, but her teachings. Her idea of objectivism, which I have to say for quite a while, has influenced me quite a bit, and definitely influenced my movie Which Way They Walk. Which Way They Walk is full of references to not only Atlas Shrugged, the teachings of objectivism, such as the scene, where one character asks Jonathan B. Thompson, the main protagonist, if you would have gotten your way, what would you have done? And Jonathan B. Thompson turns to him and says, I would have taught the public what it's like to work for themselves. That's almost directly from Atlas Shrugged. But we're not here to talk about the book. We are here to talk about the movies. Specifically a trilogy, which I bought on DVD. These are kind of a bad DVD set. I wish I bought a different one. They deserve more money than they've gotten. That's for sure, and it doesn't help that I believe Hollywood has completely blacklisted these movies beyond belief and kept them from getting the releases that they deserve. I'm not saying like a huge widespread release, but something better than what they had. And it didn't help that the marketing for these movies sucked as well. But this is a trilogy, and it kind of makes sense that these would be a trilogy because Atlas Shrugged the book is 3 parts. These films are simply called Atlas Shrugged Part 1, Atlas Shrugged Part 2, and Atlas Shrugged Part 3. These movies are okay. These were made for very minuscule budgets. And I mean it, very, very minuscule budgets. So I really admire at least the first 2 films for their ability to make something almost completely out of nothing. And I really do admire that these were financed completely out of, the love of specifically an individual. And some people who definitely helped, kickstart the project. These films are real independent filmmaking, and I really do admire that. It's like these, specifically the first 2, I'd watch them, and they'll kind of inspire me to go out and try to make something, even if it's crap. Because these movies are not masterpieces by any stretch of the imagination. But they're not bad. Well, specifically the first 2. The third one, I believe, is a bad movie, but the first 2 movies in the trilogy are not bad. They're not good, but they're not bad. They're just really inspiring. Like if, for example, I actually guarantee it, that if you want to become a filmmaker, if you want to become a director or something, or work in this field, if you will probably despise these movies because of their message. A lot of, let's face it, most of the people that work in Hollywood, their messages are usually the complete opposites of what this is, what these try to convey, which, to be honest, is one reason that attracted me to Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, because I was getting sick of all these cliches. of specifically the corporate people being the bad guys. And what does Atlas Shrugged do? Atlas Shrugged hails the corporate business people as being the good guys. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting premise. And so I picked up specifically Atlas Shrugged Part 1. And I'll be honest, I watched Atlas Shrugged Part 1 before I even picked up the book by Ayn Rand. That, to be honest, did not affect my judgment of either the book or the movie in any way. However, Part 1 did make me want to read the book, I just didn't pick it up until a couple years later. And I will say this, I believe Atlas Shrugged Part 1 is the best of the three. Atlas Shrugged Part 1, I just believe, is the best, most competent made of the films. It feels like an actual movie, if that makes any sense. And it's shot beautifully. I believe the acting is pretty good, except for a couple of parts. The casting was my favorite out of the three. Because what's interesting about this trilogy is that each film has a different director, and each film has an entirely different crew and cast. That's interesting to me. This wasn't like Lord of the Rings, where Peter Jackson shot all three movies together at the same time, which is, to be honest, if I was to make an adaptation of Atlas Shrugged into a trilogy, that's what I do. Actually, I wouldn't make it a trilogy at all. What I do is I would make a TV series, something that would probably have to play on Fox News or something like that. Each part of the book is in 3 parts, each part being an hour long. Because, let's face it, the book is huge. I mean, look at this. The book, that at least the copy that I have, is literally 1,067 pages long. That's a big book. That is one of the big things that turns people off when they start reading it, is just how thick and dense the book is. And it is thick and it is dense, but my God, when it gets going, it's so good. Specifically, the first 2 parts of the book. The casting is the best in Atlas Shrugged Part 1. And the only part in that movie particularly that I kind of rolled my eyes, went ugh at, Ellis Wyatt, you know, you get to his part, you get to his station, and John Galt has, though we don't really know it is John Galt at the time, John Galt comes up to speak to him and says in a very warm voice, not imposing but warm, you know, tells him like, I want you to come with me to Galt's Gulch, and Galt's Gulch, there we go, I hate that name, by the way. He burns his oil refinery. And Dagny Taggart, the story's protagonist, runs up and sees the oil refinery burning, and she screams no. And I hate that. Like, that was too overdramatic for my liking. It actually made me chuckle. I remember I was drinking Moxie, and I remember almost having to spit it out when I first watched it. That was too over the top, but the imagery itself was great. And especially the sign, where you see Dagny Taggart standing next to the sign that Ellis Wyatt paints, where Ellis Wyatt says, "I'm leaving it as I found it, take over, it's yours." And he's burned it, you know, to the ground. Basically, he's saying, you know, I built this, now you want to take it from me, well, here you go, I'm going to leave it as I found it, which was nothing. Atlas Shrugged Part 2 is fine, but what I hate about this particular version of the DVD is that it's presented in 16:9, the 16:9 aspect ratio. It was clearly not shot in that. Or if it was matted and then they pushed in again. And I'm like, that's so dumb. And the proof of that is, if you go online and go to like the Atlas Society or the Atlas Shrugged movie YouTube channel, which of course I've subscribed to them all, there are clips, you know, and specifically I'm thinking of this scene where Hank Rearden, who looks fantastic, by the way, in the movie, looks utterly fantastic, looks actually very similar to how I envisioned Hank Rearden looking, but his voice, he's got like a really bad smoker's voice, like he talks like this and everything. Like, I hate his voice. There's this man who sits with him and everything like that, and he's like, come on, I'm not here. He was sent by the government to basically spy on Hank Rearden's business and so on and so forth. It's like, damn, son, you're smarter than you look. If you look at that scene, I actually put in my copy of Atlas Shrugged, and I was like, oh, it's probably matted like Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. They're not. It's clearly pan and scanned, and I'm like, why would you do that? Give us the full image. And I'm not sure if they did that on Part 3 or not. Quite frankly, I don't care, because Atlas Shrugged Part 3 is a bad movie. Atlas Shrugged Part 3 I completely skip over. And admittedly, it's not just the movie. I mean, first off, the movie is just completely incompetently made. The worst casting choices ever. the number one thing that I just could not stand about Atlas Shrugged Part 3 is who they casted for John Galt. I can't stand him. He's got a face that I want to punch. He's handsome, sure, but he doesn't have a commanding presence. And something that I always envisioned John Galt, which, by the way, both the movies and the book beautifully build up to John Galt. Some of the best build-ups ever to, you know, who is John Galt. Hell, that's basically the slogan of the book. Who is John Galt? There's this man, and Dagny Taggart's trying desperately to convince him to stay. And this is an Atlas Shrugged Part 2. And it's a great scene where this tycoon has just talked to John Galt, and John Galt has just convinced him to leave with him. And Dagny Taggart just missed him. There's this great part, which is not really in the book per se. The scene is in the book, but to me it's honestly presented a little better in the movie, Part 2. Where the guy goes, yes, they can take away everything, but you know what? They can't take away this. And he points to his mind. He points to his head, his brain, his mind, the most powerful tool, which is the number one argument that Objectivism argues for, and definitely Atlas Shrugged argues for, is that the most powerful tool in the human arsenal is your own mind, and how we've lost the capability of using our own mind. And that scene is such a good representation of it. In terms of the movies, I love watching that scene over and over and over again because it's so inspirational. It's like everything in my life could be just completely falling apart like it was, quite frankly. And people could be, you know, trying to take everything away from me and so on and so forth. And it's not really it's a whole mixture of things. But I watched that scene, I'm like, you know what? Go ahead. That scene is so inspirational to me because, you know, he goes, they can't take away your mind. And I love that sequence. And Atlas Shrugged Part 2 also arguably has my favorite part in the book, which is the trial of Hank Rearden. Hank Rearden goes on trial because he did some illegal stuff in the name of the government, or in the eyes of the government, when really he was just trying to make sure somebody shores up a mine. This scene was shot badly. The scene was shot badly, but overall, I don't really agree with some of the changes that they made to the dialogue in that sequence, because I literally almost read you the entire dialogue of the book from Hank Rearden's trial. Believe it or not, in such a thick book, it's a very short sequence. Why the writers of the movie chose to exclude a lot of that dialogue or to summarize it doesn't really make much sense to me, specifically because it's such a poignant moment in the book, and also because it is short in itself. This isn't like John Galt's 50 fucking page speech that he gives, which quite frankly is a big problem I have with it. You could have cut that in half and I would have been more okay with it. That's, a big problem. In fact, that's one of the few things I actually liked about Atlas Shrugged Part 3. Even though I didn't like the actor, how they approached the 50-page John Galt speech was great. You can't have a 50-page speech in a movie, because in script terms, one page is roughly equal to 1 minute of screen time. I found that usually it's a little over 30 seconds, but you can't have him standing there for 15 minutes giving a speech. You get bored. Might as well watch a documentary. So I admire the way how they truncated that. But with Hank Rearden's trial, the only part that I really liked about it was, his idea of bring guns, which is basically a summarized version of this. And the line, like, Hank Rearden goes up to the public and he goes, "You're basically asking to steal my product, just like any burglar. The only difference is that a burglar doesn't ask for my permission first." I like that line, and that's a summary of almost a paragraph of dialogue in the book. And I also like Hank Rearden's line in the movie, "You wouldn't want to understand that you work for nothing but your own profit." He says, "Yes, I want it understood clearly." But at the same time, I'm like, he genuinely says in here, and I've read it to you, he genuinely says, "Fellows, that you work for nothing but your own profit." Hank Rearden genuinely says, "I work for nothing but my own profit. I earn it." He's so much more of a badass in the book than he is in the movie. One of the things that really suffers in the movies is that they almost completely cut out the romance between Dagny Taggart and Hank Rearden. It's in the first one, but they kind of like slip over it as like a fling, like it was a one-time thing. Well, in the book, they clearly are like madly in love with each other. Which book three of Atlas Shrugged, I have a big problem with. To me, Dagny Taggart dramatically should not have fallen in love with John Galt. She should have stayed with Hank Rearden, because to me, her and Hank Rearden are far more compatible with each other than her and suddenly this knight in shining armor, John Galt, who, my biggest flaw with John Galt is that he is flawless. I'm like, alright, he's kind of a boring character. It's like we see him and we're building up to him and he's nothing like we were expecting. To be honest, I wanted a far more fatherly figure in John Galt than a romantic character. I never wanted him to be a romance interest for Dagny Taggart, and that's exactly what she winds up doing. And suddenly he's introduced in the last book, and she just goes head over heels for him, and completely leaves Hank Rearden in the dust, which I feel bad for her. But also, movie 3 also cuts out my favorite parts of book 3. Hank Rearden isn't even in film 3 of the Atlas Shrugged series. The only reference we get to there's Hank Rearden is they look up and they see a jet flying over and he's like, that's Hank Rearden. Really? He's a huge crux of the story in Atlas Shrugged Part 3. By the time Part 3 comes, what's happening to Dagny Taggart and what's happening to Hank Rearden are almost two separate things. In fact, they're only together, I believe, like once or twice in book 3, which is too bad. But like they cut out Hank Rearden almost entirely completely, and Hank Rearden has such a good fucking scene. And it is when the government tries to stage an insurrection at his factory, and his factory workers actually stand up for Hank Rearden and so on and so forth. And what happens is previously, sometime, I can't remember if it's towards the end of book 2 or in the beginning of book 3, Hank Rearden's brother, and this is in the book, Hank Rearden's brother basically begs him for a desk job where he can just sit back and do nothing, and Hank Rearden utterly refuses. He's like, you expect me to pay you a salary position for doing nothing? No. If you're going to work for me, you're going to work for me. And of course that pisses off his brother, who is a no-good looter. That same sequence, not far along away, there's this boy that comes up to him, a young man who worked for the government. And this kid is like, Hank, please give me a job. I'm done sucking shit out of other people's pockets. I'm paraphrasing, of course. I'm done not earning my keep. I will be a janitor for all. I just want a job, Hank. Please give me a job. And of course, Hank can't give him a job because the government has just frozen all bonds and frozen all growth and of businesses and so on and so forth. Really complicated stuff. Hank Rearden goes, I would hire you in a heartbeat. Well, in book 3, that same kid tried to warn the workers at the factory, at Hank Rearden's factory, at Rearden Steel, that, I'd be wearing my Rearden Steel sweater, by the way, but it's way too hot for me to do that. He goes to the factory to warn them that there's an insurrection happening, only to discover that he's too late, this kid, and he gets shot. And he's crawling towards the street for help, and Hank Rearden happens to drive by and sees the kid, and he helps. He holds the kid and comforts him before, he dies. The kid unfortunately dies. It has some of the greatest dialogue in it ever. One of the few times in the book, too, where Hank Rearden shows his true sentimental sides. Because one of the character traits of Hank Rearden is that he comes off as a bit cold, but he's not. He's just very bad at expressing his emotions towards people. And he's very logical, which is definitely a wonderful trait that a lot of objectivists have. The kid's like dying where it's just like, is this what it feels like to want something? And Hank Rearden says, yes it is. It's the greatest feeling in the world. And the kid agrees with him, and then the kid dies in his arms. And I'm like, it's such a wonderful scene. Completely erased from film 3. Another sequence that is almost completely erased from film 3 deals almost entirely with the romance between Dagny Taggart and Hank Rearden. And that is Hank Rearden's bitch of a wife. The actress that plays her in film 2 and film 3 I don't like, but the actress that plays her in film 1 I really like, but whatever. In the book, she basically blackmails Dagny Taggart to go on the radio and support the president's act, to completely freeze all you know, growth of any business at all. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. And, or else she will release to the public that, you know, Hank Rearden and her had an affair together. Which, of course, seems minuscule nowadays, but when the book was written, that was a huge deal. For example, if you watch, you know, if you read The Fountainhead, there's a character that gets a divorce. Well, when that movie was made, you couldn't have divorce in movies, so Ayn Rand had to write that he kills himself, which to me was way overly dramatic and didn't need to be. Dagny Taggart agrees to go on the air and defend the president, but before she goes on the interview, she basically goes, fuck you, and says, yeah, I had an affair with Hank Rearden to the public, and she admits everything. And I'm like, oh my god, this is such a great scene. She's so badass in that sequence. She's like, yeah, I don't give a fuck what you guys say. Fuck you, I'm done caring. Which is a whole part of their characters, both her and Hank Rearden's character. And I just adored that sequence, not in the film. And a lot of that actually probably does come from the fact that there is a time gap in Atlas in the book and when the movies were made. The books were released in the 60s, which was a much different time. Well, the movies take place in modern day, which is weird because it makes almost no sense to have this movie take place in modern day times because it's all about trains. How trains have now like replaced trucks for transporting goods. I don't care how short oil would get. It's so much cheaper to just use trucks in the longer haul. It just doesn't make sense why they'd go back to trains. Why, you know, but in the book it makes sense because in the 60s we were still using, 50s and 60s we were still using trains like there's no tomorrow. And divorce was a much larger thing in the 50s and 60s. Well, today it doesn't really fucking matter. People get divorced all the time. Which is why if I was to make Atlas Shrugged into movies or a series like I'd want to do, I would either do a period piece that actually genuinely takes place in the 50s and 60s, because a lot of people don't know this, and the movies do a piss poor job at portraying this. Atlas Shrugged takes place over a long, 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 long period of time. The movies, you can't really tell. Everything kind of feels really condensed together. Or, I would do what I did in Which Way They Walk. Which Way They Walk, let's face it, is a piece of shit. But I would just create my own universe. Actually, a better comparison is what they did in Batman the Animated Series, where they had Gotham be like in this time period that never existed. It's completely their own universe. Like, they still have black and white TVs, they have blimps flying around all over the place, but yet they have modern cars and so on and so forth. And stuff like that. That's actually probably what I would have done with Atlas Shrugged if I was to make it into a series more than anything else. But another problem with the movies that really come out, other than the book, is that the book, with films, the story is almost boring. Like, it's just about corporate espionage, and it's about, you know, us versus the government. It comes off as almost boring, which is why I almost say Atlas Shrugged can't be made into a movie. Because everything just happens, the premise of it is kind of boring. You know, the premise of it is kind of boring. And stuff like jumping into characters' minds and what they do, you can do in a book to make it interesting. That's one of the great things about books, is that books you can take forever to describe one thing. You can take as many pages as you fucking want to describe one thing. I mean, look at John Galt's speech in Atlas Shrugged. It's 50 fucking pages. 50 pages! But in a movie, you can't do that. In a movie, you literally can't jump into a character's head. You have to show it, not tell it. Well, in a book, all you do is tell. And with a movie, the kind of premise of Atlas Shrugged kind of makes for a boring film. And I know probably a lot of objectivists would fight me that tooth and claw. But something like The Fountainhead would make a much better film. Or, better yet, don't remake The Fountainhead, but make a film adaptation of We the Living. Oh my god, We the Living is such a good book, guys. I don't care if you're an objectivist or not. We the Living is such a good book, you should really read it. That needs to be made into a genuine movie, which of course it has. And the Italians made it into a movie, but the Italian version of the film, though good, is not overly good. The movies are just a mixed bag. The one that I do recommend people watch is, you know, Atlas Shrugged Part 1. That's the best part, you know. And Atlas Shrugged Part 1 has a fantastic sequence that I actually find better than in the book, and that's just my opinion. And that's when we meet Hank Rearden's wife for the first time. And I always said that if I was straight, if I wasn't gay, if I had a girlfriend, I would buy her, if I really liked it, I would buy her the Hank Rearden bracelet. And, you know, this just goes into the whole mentality of Hank Rearden. This will be the last thing I talk about, I swear. Hank Rearden gives her a present. And that's when he finally perfects Rearden steel, which is stronger and better than regular steel. The first ore that he pours, he turns into a bracelet for his wife. So he presents it to his wife, and she's like, "What is this?" And all of her friends and Hank Rearden's brother just scoff at Hank Rearden, saying like, "Oh, a true man would have given her a diamond bracelet. Would have given her something for her pleasure, not his." And I'm like, this is something that I genuinely wanted to explore, because I really want to turn Which Way They Walk into a movie, into a book, because I could do so much more with the book. And that scene in the films particularly inspired me, which it does happen in the book, don't get me wrong. I just think it's handled a little better in the movie. Or this particular scene is handled a little better in the movie. And she's like, "Oh great, now I'm going to be wearing the bracelet that, you know, sewage pipes are made out of and railroad spikes are made out of." She just scoffs at it. Well, if Hank Rearden gave me that, and he said this was made from the first ore of Rearden metal, oh my God, I'd be fawning over it. I'd be like, this is this man's livelihood. And he just gave me the first piece of it. The very first thing that he did, he thought of me. And I would have been like, oh my God, this guy's perfect. Which is something that I wanted to do in, you know, Which Way They Walk. Instead of it being, you know, Jonathan B. Thompson doing metal, what it would have been is it would have been an actual railroad spike. And Jonathan B. Thompson hands it to his wife and said, "This is the first railroad spike I paid for my new company." And he hands it to his wife and gives it to her as basically a trophy more than a bracelet. And I would have had, just to understand that those two are very compatible with each other, would have had her just fawn over it. In reality, I think handing somebody a gift that has sentimental value to you, to you yourself, is much more powerful of a gift than just buying them a diamond bracelet and handing it to them. That diamond bracelet, other than the fact that you paid for it, doesn't have real sentimental value. Something that has sentimental value to you yourself, and you hand it to your significant other or a friend or whatever, to me means so much more than just being handed something. And I truly mean that. And, you know, that's just something I really just love about Hank Rearden and the whole mentality. And I really mean this. When I picked up Atlas Shrugged and started reading it, I was in a very dark space. I had tried to kill myself. I really did. And I was smart enough, don't get me wrong, I was smart enough to realize that if I didn't get help, you know, I would probably end up hurting myself really bad. And I was smart enough to realize something was wrong. You know, and I went to the hospital for a couple weeks and so on and so forth, for a week and so on and so forth. And, you know, and it sucked. You know, it absolutely sucked. And that was definitely the lowest point I have ever been in my life. That really was. Well, I went home, you know, to New Hampshire for several weeks after that, before going back and pursuing my jobs and so on and so forth. And I picked up Atlas Shrugged. And I read it cover to cover in 2 weeks. I could not put it down. I could not put it down. And then that summer, I reread it. And then, you know, over the course of the fall, I reread it again. And I'm not even kidding when I say that the book, Atlas Shrugged, fucking saved my life. And I really mean it. Like, despite all the problems I have with book 3, which I didn't really get into because I wasn't really talking about the book here, I was more kind of referring to the movies, but book 3 I have some genuine big problems with. But book 1 and 2 of Atlas Shrugged are just so good that, to me, I can just read book 1 and 2 over and over again and just be absorbed in it, just as I was the first time I picked it up. Are some parts boring? Yes. It's a very difficult book to get into. Man, when it gets going, does it get going. It is such a wonderful book. And I love the structure of Ayn Rand's sentences and how she writes. I just love it. And I know some people don't, and I can understand why. So her dialogue, not her dialogue, but her descriptions can be seen as kind of robotic. But I love it. I just love it. And I mean it. This book saved my life. And I can easily say that even before I even knew what objectivism was, I practiced those principles, most of those principles before that. But then I abandoned those principles and started thinking in other directions and so on and so forth. And it fucked me over, and then I started reading this book again. I was like, my God, I get it now. And I've started, really proud to say that I call myself an objectivist now. Quite a huge objectivist now. In fact, one of the slogans for AN Productions for a while was, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man nor ask another man to live for mine. Which is the entire principle of objectivism in a nutshell, which is from this book. Watch the first 2 movies if you want to, if you're interested in making films, because they are genuinely great examples of low-budget filmmaking and people trying to do the best they can with what they got. But they're not great films. The book is great. Fantastic. Read the book. I highly recommend it. Changed my life, saved my life, and I can't hail it enough. And that's why Atlas Shrugged will always be one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book. So hit the subscribe button if you want more. Like AN Productions on Facebook if you want all up-to-date information on what we're doing there, including ANPN Broadcast, which is we take short films from people and we just broadcast it live. No strings attached, just promotion, and it's great. And a lot of fun. And this includes interviews with people and, short skits exclusive to ANP Network. You've seen some of the stuff that we've done by the time that this video is released that we do on ANP Network, and so on and so forth. So check that out. Like the Godzilla Saga for all up-to-date information on that. A lot of new shit coming out for that, and new videos. And in the end, this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, sayonara. My God, I didn't bring up BioShock once.